Don't know what to read for next month's book club?
What? We're supposed to read for those clubs? I thought the aim of the game was to get smashed and complain about your marriage.
It's an Irish pub for middle-class 40-year-olds.
Except Irish pub goers read more, because when we lift up our glass, we look down at the coaster and mouth Guinness. Another Guinness? No worries, mate. Coming right up. No! Oh, see, this is why my kids don't recognise me face when I finally get home. I'm forced to spend all my bloody free time here.
Then get the fantasy bestseller critics are calling the greatest work of fiction the world has ever seen. The Daily Telegraph.
You know it's gotta be good when computer nerds have countless forums about it.
In the prequel, Dr. Joe's Debt Cure, we discovered that the Dark Army of Labour, controlled by an evil witch, had put a curse on Australia by giving it a historically extremely low level of public debt.
Huh? Why is that a bestseller? Don't act so shocked, so is 50 Shades of Grey. You don't get to be surprised after that was a bestseller. All bets are off, I guess. But an insignificant amount of national debt is the conflict in this plot. Doesn't sound scary enough to be an adult book. Are you sure this isn't aimed at kids? There's a crossword and comics in the middle of it. What are you talking about? Of course it's aimed at adults. Every mature human being would love an Easter show ride and show bag guide part 2. Just like a mature human being would love this year's budget, as I didn't get me Flavor Flav poo bag this Easter show, where you go to the counter, you ask the attendant and they tell you wait 10 minutes. Then they go to the back of the stall and force feed Flavor Flav prunes until he screams, "I can't shit no more today." Ah!
Shut up and poo. Shut up and poo now.
I can't do no more dookie, man.
That's why I like this year's budget, as they can replace Flavor Flav with our treasurer next year, as Flavor Flav's out of shit and Joe's clearly full of it.
For those familiar with Murdoch's genius fantasy works, Australia just last year was in the thick of a debt crisis. Even though the US has been in debt its entire existence, bar a couple of years in the 1830s, with a historical average of 30% to GDP debt, nonetheless our 12% to GDP debt was an emergency because...
It's not like normal debt, because our debt has this magical horcrux on it that causes intergenerational theft. How cool is this book?
According to the Telegraph, Kevin Rudd was a ghost burglar, able to steal from your family for generations to come. Want me to say ni hao to your great grandkids for you?
Okay, I'm having issues with this plot. Why do you always have to rag on my escapism, Jacinda? It is fiction. Just go with it. No, Karen, this plot hole's too big to ignore, okay? According to this novel, 12% to GDP debt that took 5 years to accumulate, that's a budget emergency. However, when the Liberal Party increases national debt to 18% in a single year, all of a sudden there is no emergency, everything's hunky-dory, and on top of that the character Joe Hockey says despite those figures that...
Are we getting back to surplus?
It's increased 50% in a year! Yes, because you're not focusing on the key plot point, which is that Joe Hockey is a fat treasurer by day and thin sexy surgeon by night who is...
Getting the deficit down.
It's doubled in a year by the Liberal Party!
The deficit went from $17 billion to $35 billion in a single year. But in Teletubby land, that's Labour's fault because anything's possible in fantasy, and in this world, Labour were spending like drunken sailors.
Well then what does that make you? A drunken gambling addict, 'cause check out these numbers!
According to not the Daily Telegraph and Joe Hockey's apparent ability to see into alternate universes where Labour's still in power and...
Oh, it's not looking good. The deficit is definitely higher under Labour and Beck Hewitt's dead. Yeah, the union's crowd-mauled her to death. That's... what a shame.
An actual source, in fact the most trusted source there is, the PIFO report, clearly stated that the deficit would have peaked under Labour at $55 billion, even with their quote-unquote reckless spending. Yet 6 months after the Liberal Party got in power, the sister report of the PIFO report, the MIFO report, stated that the number has now skyrocketed to $123 billion because the supposed
party that's trying to save Australia from debt
is now spending more than the previous governments of Gillard and Rudd. Why?
And this is by far my favourite twist in the novel because it includes our finance minister being a T-800 robot who states,
"A lot has changed in the economy." Yet this robot, who denies he's a robot by specifically going out of his way to claim,
I'm not a robot.
Apparently when Labour complained of going into debt, there was no real reason for doing that, just a
global financial crisis!
That, according to the Telegraph, was just excuse-making. Now, if you want to see a treasurer who's experiencing real economic headwinds, it's Joe Hockey who's seeing that the iron ore price is more than halved.
What? Here we go. According to this hockey character, who's the good guy in this novel, despite looking like a mid-tier mafia boss who owns a chain of strip clubs?
In this world, you gotta look out for number one.
The worst economic condition since the Great Depression is nothing but an excuse for going into deficit, but the fact that the price of iron ore is no longer at its highest position in the history of the world by far and is still very, very high, that's a good reason for doubling the deficit. Yes, and don't you see the romanticism in that? He made a grand gamble, hoping against hope that...
Yeah, I thought it was safe to assume that the price of iron ore would stay at 13 times its historical average forever.
I like those odds. Yeah, I think that's why I really warmed to Joe Hockey's character in this book, because he reminds us all of that same Uncle Joe we all have who invests in things like...
Ain't it? To its ancestors to hoist a bid on. Look at that spike. That stock ain't going nowhere except the same place their planes, baby. Up.
This budget, which still has lurking within it the exact same unfathomable cuts to pensions, schools and hospitals, now proves that even their core promise of a surplus at whatever the cost of people's lives was just broken promise number 51, as the deficit has doubled under the Liberal Party for no reason other than Joe Hockey spending billions of dollars of our money to buy back votes. And yet, nothing but pluses for courage as he still has the gall to call this budget responsible.
Oh, so the Daily Telegraph is a classic feel-good novel about a bunch of losers in primary school overcoming adversity by figuring out that if they just give people enough lollies, they will like them, and then showing us all by growing up and doing exactly the same thing in government. Yeah, see, now you're getting it. If you just ignore the massive plot holes and the very inconsistent characters, this is a really heartwarming budget.
It sure is. The Daily Telegraph presents the 2015 budget, inspired by a true story.
Please press the subscribe button now.
Come on. I am not a robot.